as I say, this was a discussion way back about March between the Reverend David Skuse, Pauline and I as to how to set it up. And we decided to broaden it out, not just look at the decade of centennials, but maybe look at church and state and the various traditions in Ireland. Therefore, it's going to be a very broad kind of look, and people may want to focus in on certain things that we've mentioned or perhaps have overlooked when it comes to the question and answer, really. So could I ask Pauline, please, to throw up the first slide, please? And yep, if we get the slideshow, then that's great. And you can see the title there, what I'm hoping to do. Obviously, we're going to, even trench in the post-partition period a bit. The first slide, please, Pauline. Thank you. And I mean, just to remind us all that, of course, we had, the Celts arriving in Ireland, 500 BC, bringing the Irish language, giving us 95% of the place names. A language, remember, that was still widely spoken. I mean, in 1820, 140,000 people in County Tyrone spoke Irish. In the 1911 census, a large population around Red Bay and Rathlin in the Glens and coast of Antrim spoke Irish, though it was declining. And of course, the Great Famine sees Irish rapidly decline. But of course, you had the Celts, but then you had the Vikings from really 795 on, raiding the Irish coast, raiding the great universities in Ireland's golden age, like Clonmacnoise and Devonish. And then, of course, you had the Anglo-Normans who arrived over, of course, in 1169, the descendants of William the Conqueror, who conquered Dublin. And of course, Dublin becomes the centre of the Pale. The next slide, please, maybe, Pauline. And of course, the Pale is the area really around Dublin, where the king or the queen's writ runs right through until the early 17th century. I can't see the size, but maybe they're coming up. The key thing is that, of course, we talk about that phrase beyond the Pale, because it was within that greater Dublin area, maybe a 50-mile radius of Dublin, that the king's writ, the king's English law and custom, and indeed costume prevailed during that whole period. And when, of course, Henry VIII in 1541 declared himself King of Ireland, he was the first British monarch to declare himself King of Ireland. Henry II in the 12th century had called himself Lord of Ireland, but Henry VIII became the King of Ireland, and Ireland was then impacted by the various changes of Henry VIII's reign, particularly, of course, the impact of the Reformation in England and Scotland eventually, which begins to affect Ireland. Could we have the next slide, please, Pauline? Maybe there's an issue there. So what can I say about Henry VIII? Of course, Ireland by the 16th century was a series of Gaelic kingdoms. We talked about the various the kings throughout Ireland, the Tuatha, the kings of the different areas. Counties were, remember, introduced with the Pale and with the Plantation of Ulster. Ireland was shired into the modern counties like Fermanagh, like Tyrone, which used lakes and mountains and rivers to kind of demarcate the various counties. They were based on the old baronies, which were introduced by the Anglo-Normans, and before that, the Gaelic kind of units. Now, really, I'd like to see a slide if that's possible. I don't know if that is possible. I can see myself, but oh, sugar. I don't know what I've done here.
I just want to check with everybody. Can everybody else see the slide?
Yes.
We could see the slides.
Right.
Yeah.
Ah, dear. Well, let's see. I can't see them at all, so I don't know why that is. So anyway, if I assume that you're looking at the second slide, but I'm going to have to guess what that is.
Oh gosh, Eamon, that's going to be awkward for you.
Is it? Yeah, I don't know why I'm not seeing them. There must be
if you go up to view, if you go up maybe to view, maybe gallery up at your top.
Yeah, I'm going to go up there. Let's see. I can see view more. I can see more. Let's see. Oh dear. This hasn't happened before.
Gallery view.
I can't get. Oh yes, gallery view. No, I'm in the gallery and I can see everybody else, but I can't see the slide. Anyway,
I'll try it again, Eamon.
Ah, great! You brought them up now. And
you can see it now.
Yeah, yeah. And
do you need me to go back or forward?
Yes,
then, Eamon?
just go back, please, Pauline. And go back again. Yes, indeed. So yeah, next slide then. Queen
Next slide
Elizabeth
then.
would be great. Super. This is absolutely brilliant. So we have Queen Elizabeth here, and of course the Reformation was consolidated in England under Elizabeth I. For one thing, she had a very long reign, unlike her Catholic half-sister Mary, known as Bloody Mary when I was at school. Maybe some people in the audience, particularly history teachers of whom I see at least one, who will remember the idea of Bloody Mary, a short reign of perhaps 5 years when she persecuted the Protestants. And you had the burning of the Protestant martyrs, Cranmer, Latimer, Ridley, and so on. Then comes Elizabeth, and of course she persecuted the Catholics. There was a remnant of upper-class Catholicism among the nobility in the north of England, whereas you'll see in Midsummer Murders from time to time in an old mansion in Northumberland or somewhere, they find a priest's hall where a butler was really a disguised priest, and that survives in the north of England. But in general, Elizabeth, of course, sees the Reformation through during her long reign. Now the problem is, of course, Gaelic Ireland resisted the Reformation. Just give you an example. By 1600, by which time England had been Protestant for nearly half a century, pretty largely, there were only 120 Protestant converts in Ireland from the native Irish, 120. The rest were bishops and archbishops and other people, officials who had been brought in from England. So we have to explain that. And of course, the one thing was, of course, first of all, the Irish language was an impenetrable barrier to the dissemination of the Reformed faith in Ireland. Secondly, there was no particular prophet or, if you like, reformer emerged in Ireland. Ireland had no John Knox at all. You had important bishops like Jeremy Taylor and Down and Dromore in the sort of 1660s and others. But the Protestant faith spread very, 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 very thinly as a result of that. And of course, it was even more the case outside the Pale in Elizabeth's reign. Not only that, but the Gaelic chieftains. If we go to the next slide, please. We have a sense, maybe I haven't shown you of Gaelic Ireland, but if you look at the north here, you had, of course, in the north, where it says Ulster 1609, you had the O'Neills. They covered Tyrone and modern South Derry or South Londonderry, right up into O'Callaghan's country, which was the north coast of Antrim, really, to some extent. The O'Neills were a major clan, of course, and they had all sorts of subsets. You had the O'Devlins, the O'Donnellys, the O'Quinns, the McCrorys, so many people, names still there today, the Maguires of Fermanagh, the O'Hanlons and Armagh, the McGinnises and Down, the O'Donnells and Donegal. And really, I want you to think about that, because in that area, which is kind of marked off in colour, in the north of Ireland, this was the last Gaelic Catholic bastion on the whole island. Because remember, the Pale had been conquered during the 12th, 13th century, and an area around Belfast known as the Earldom of Ulster had emerged under John de Courcy in the late 1100s, 1200s. And I mean, it meant that Carrickfergus, Belfast and Dundrum had Norman castles and was linked to the Pale. But of course, there was no religious problem until the kind of 1530s, 1550s even. Everyone was of the same Christian faith across Europe. But of course, as Ireland is in a process of change and flux by the 17th century, we are into an age of religious warfare across Europe. And Ireland is impacted on that. And of course, during the late 17th century, around the time, 16th century, during the time of the Spanish Armada, 1588, the great Gaelic clans, the O'Neills, the Maguires, the O'Donnells, they had been certainly plotting with Catholic France and Catholic Spain against Protestant England. Elizabeth knew that, and she was determined, of course, to stand for authority on Gaelic Catholic Ireland. And that leads eventually, of course, to plans for Plantation. And eventually, under her successor, James I of England, James VI of Scotland, as he had been James Stuart, a plantation scheme gets underway. There had been previous forays. Some of them had failed in areas like North Down, where the O'Neills of Clandeboy, and that sort of orange area there on eastern Ulster, modern Antrim and Down, the O'Neills of Clandeboy, who had moved from Tyrone in the Middle Ages into the Belfast area, they, of course, were resisting any threat to their lands or indeed their religion. Remember, this isn't a united Ireland. The Gaelic clans all had their own patrimonies, their own territories, their own tuatha. By the kind of 11th, 12th century, the idea of an ardry, a high king, was beginning to emerge, but the idea was not fully developed when the plantation occurred. And it probably explains why the Catholic Irish always, if you like, looked fondly on the British Crown, despite all sorts of tensions and differences, because there was this monarchical tradition in the DNA of, you know, the native inhabitants of Tyrone, Fermanagh, Clare, Cork, you name it, from the days of the Gaelic kings. The scheme rolled out by James the First was very simple, and it was unveiled in 1610. The province of Ulster was to be conquered, and of course, 6 counties were earmarked for plantation, not the present 6 counties. You have to get that clear. Usually where you find a royal school, as in Dungannon, as in Portora, as in Raphoe, as in Cavan, you have one of the official plantation counties. The exception would be the new county of Londonderry, which was composed of large part of the old O'Cahan country, County Coleraine, parts of Donegal and Tyrone, and of course was named Londonderry in homage to the London companies who had put up the money for the kind of, if you like, infrastructure of the plantation in the northwest. It's interesting to look at the language at that time. Donegal, Inishowen was O'Doherty's country. In the northwest, Doe was MacSweeney country. And then you had O'Donnell country, the O'Donnells of OConnell. That was regarded as a kind of a hostile Afghanistan on the northwest borders of Ulster that had to be kept in safekeeping. So Derry was developed as a walled city. Of course, depending on your predilections, I've used Derry, I've used Londonderry, which is right? Well, the confusion really begins in the actual charter of Derry, 1613, because if you read the charter, it says, because, of course, of the generosity of the guilds of London, this city shall be named Londonderry. Grand, after the old Gaelic, Derry Columkill, Derry Columkill, the Oak Grove, that's in Columkill. But then it goes on to say, but it's a long document, and the scribes get a bit fed up and they write on it. But because of popular usage, in the rest of this document, we refer to it as Derry. So even in 1613, there was a sense of Stroke City, even before Jerry Anderson confronted that conundrum back in the 1980s, was it? And made us all laugh a bit despite our problems. It was John Hume, by the way, as a young schoolmaster in 1962, making a film to promote the North, the maiden city, if you like, as a capital of industry and commerce for Northwest Ireland, who actually in a programme argued that the city should be called Londonderry officially and by everyone to reflect the two traditions. So there's an interesting take. Nonetheless, 6 counties are planted. And of course, to incentivize the now Protestant inhabitants of the lowlands of Scotland, from which most of them came, where there was a land problem, where there was land hunger, where many of the weaver clans along the Scottish borders had been raiding English cattle, James wanted them out. And so the Elliots, for example, were transplanted from the lowlands of Scotland, the Scottish borders, to County Fermanagh. If you're an Elliot, I'm very sorry, but I have to tell the facts. So the upshot was, not only that, Graham's, other families are brought over to South Ulster during this period, and the plantation gets underway. The north of Ireland is depicted as a land of milk and honey. You have the great undertakers, landlords, often soldiers in the service of the king, who actually were granted land in Ireland. They were known as servitors. Then you had the great undertakers. A tenth of the land was reserved for what they called the deserving Irish. But clearly not many of the original inhabitants were going to get land. And the other problem was, of course, that 3 counties were not planted. You can see them in kind of that kind of buff orange colour there, Antrim Down and Monaghan. Monaghan was to be an internal plantation. People would be moved from the existing planted areas. Antrim and Down were planted by 2 Scottish lairds in Ayrshire, who were given land in Ireland. They did a deal with Con O'Neill. He got the sharp end of the stick, I think, and they got Antrim and Down, some of the richest land, of course, in the whole of Ulster. East Donegal, the area called the Lagan, was planted from Scotland. And of course, that area became very rich land held by not just Scottish settlers, the heartland of Ulster Scots, but by the Lagan army. a major military force which ranged across the province, fighting, if you like, the armies of, if you like, the king and indeed the Confederation of Kilkenny in the 1640s. So we have a sense of this changing pattern. The problem was, of course, it was impossible to attract enough settlers to counterbalance the numbers of the native Irish who were there. And the idea was to move the native Irish off the land by a certain date. The date was put back, and in the end they were allowed to stay. And if we take Tyrone in particular, in the middle there, it's a kind of a frozen image of the failure of the plantation, where the planter and the Gael, the old Gaelic stock, the new settler stock, lived cheek by jowl, and still do. And as you know, in rural Ulster, everybody knows a townland's complexion, whether it's nationalist or unionist. They don't have to look for the curbstones in the local hamlet. They kind of know, because land, because of a taboo in the north of Ireland, has rarely ever changed hands. And if you don't believe me, you should tune into Louis J. Walsh's play, The Auction in Killybuck, written in 1912 by a county dairy solicitor about a land sale and how, in fact, it becomes a political issue. And of course, you're all aware of that tradition, taboo, in the province of Ulster, 9 counties. So the plantation gets underway, and of course the new settlers had to build towns, whether it be Belfast, established by Sir Arthur Chichester as a small town, mainly Scottish town, of about 500 around 1613 when it gets its charter, or the towns of Omagh, in Enniskillen, built on Kathleen's Island when the Maguire Castle had stood, at Newry. I mean, you couldn't throw a stone and hit an Ulster town that's not a plantation town. One of the notable exceptions are, 2 exceptions are Carrickfergus, which was Norman, Dundrum, of course, which was a Norman village in the shadow of a huge Norman castle. So the plantation gets underway. And of course, in 1607, you have the flight of the Earls. The Gaelic Irish, O'Neill, O'Donnell, Maguire, leave Ireland forever, and leave, really, the Gaelic Island leaders, of course, during this period. Earlier plantations had been attempted. You can see the Midlands, Laois and Offaly, became, of course, known as Queen's County and King's County. But of course, they failed to attract a sufficiency of settlers from England. The land changed hands, but not the population. Munster was settled. Again, it wasn't a great success. You had landlords like, for example, Sir Walter Raleigh, who brought the potato to Ireland, given a large estate in North County Cork, East County Cork, at Youghal during that period. Many of these landlords didn't stay in the south. But, it becomes the basis of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy later on, as indeed law and order is, British law and order, English law and order is applied to Ireland. The next slide, please. So we are a plantation landscape, and we're all shaped by the plantation. And there's a better idea of the 6 counties with the kind of extent of the British families, as they call them, the settlers from the lowlands of Scotland, where the bulk came from, and some from England, settled. Notice how weak it is as you go west, Antrim and Down are not included, but they were heavily planted from Scotland. But if you look at, Donegal is not heavily planted at all, apart from the east, the richest land. And Cavan and Monaghan, you have focal points. But the old clans, the O'Reillys of Breffni, the Cavan clan, the Maguires of Fermanagh, the O'Neills, the MacDonalds of Antrim, who had come from Scotland in the Middle Ages, the McGuinnesses of Down, they are all still very much on the ground. Good example, Charles de Gaulle. General de Gaulle, the man who said no to Britain joining the EU. You may or may not have agreed with him. He felt they wouldn't last very long in it. But nonetheless, General de Gaulle was a descendant on his mother's side of one of the McCartons of County Down, Marie-Angelique McCarton, whose ancestor had left Ireland as one of the wild geese after the Boyne and settled in France. We move on to the next slide, please. And of course, the Gaelic Irish resented the loss of their lands. They resented new restrictions. They resented the encroachments of sheriffs on their property, as the old kind of Gaelic laws, the Brehon laws, were set aside. And you have the rising of 1641, something that lives on in the consciousness of the Protestant tradition in Northern Ireland today. The Orange Order has banners recalling the bridge at Portadown, where Protestant men, women and children were forced to walk by Sir Phelim O'Neill, forced to walk on the frozen ice of the River Bann. The ice broke and then they were done to death with weapons. And that kind of lives on. Now, at the time, there was a lot of propaganda about 1641. And some exaggerated reports in England claimed that 100,000 Protestants had been massacred. Well, I mean, there were only 150,000 people in the whole of Ireland, but something like 10,000 Protestants either died by the sword, but most of them died actually from exposure, being driven into the countryside in the late autumn, winter of 1641, and we have those depositions today. And that is a major element in the distrust that is sown between the two traditions in Ireland, because until that point, some of the Scottish settlers were Gaelic speakers, so their language was understandable to people who spoke Irish in Tyrone or Fermanagh, for example. And there was a very good relationship between the Scottish settlers and the Irish, despite religion. But that begins to change after 1641. Next slide, please. I haven't time to go into all of this in the detail maybe I'm doing, but Cromwell, of course, that's the massacre on the Bann. This woodcut kind of captures the massacre of 1641 in the Bann, which sets a headline. And remember, as you know, we're all very much shaped by the past. I mean, I'm thinking of the farmer quoted in A.T.Q. Stewart's book, what does he call that book? The 1966 book, you know, The Ulster Crisis, in which he quotes a farmer interviewed in 1886 somewhere in County Tyrone, and the farmer talks about the recent plantations. To people, this was all recent. It lived on in the folk memory, and on both sides of the community, the brutal deeds of these days, perpetrated by each side or the other, lost nothing in the telling. The next slide, please. And of course, well, maybe we've missed a slide. Can we just go back one? I think we've missed a slide. No, we haven't. Okay, forward again then, please. And the next slide, please. This is my fault. I have put a slide in too soon. And here we have Cromwell. But of course, Cromwell emerges, the Lord Protector, executes the king. He believes in godly rule. He leads his Irish campaign in 1649. You have the massacres of the garrisons of, for example, Drogheda and Wexford. And people talk about the curse that is Cromwell in Catholic Ireland. He sends about at least 20, 30,000 Irish Catholics as slaves to Barbados. And you know the story of the Black Irish of Montserrat, the only place outside the former British Empire, Ireland and America that celebrates St. Patrick's Day. And if you go to the Black Irish of Montserrat, if you go to Montserrat today, you get black people with names like Murphy and Kelly, who are the descendants of Irish who intermarried with black slaves like themselves in the past. So Cromwell has a major impact on the Irish question. You probably know, of course, that the king is restored in 1660. Interesting story. I better not tell too many or we'll be here to midnight. But in 1955, a survey was done of blood groups in the south of Ireland, in the Republic. And it discovered that most people had the same, you know, blood groups, except on the west of Ireland in the Aran Islands. And when they looked at the Aran Islands, the blood group there matched the fenlands of England. How do you explain that? Because everybody in the Aran Islands was an O'Malley or an O'Gara, descended from the great pirate queen of the 16th century, Granuaile, Grace O'Malley, Granuaile. And they couldn't understand it. And then they realized Cromwell had a garrison on the Aran Islands. And of course, after the Restoration, they hadn't heard about it. You didn't have mobile phones then, believe it or not. And suddenly the Cavaliers came looking for not just the regicides who'd executed the king, who were all executed themselves by Charles II, but they wanted Cromwellians, Roundheads, who were secreted in remote parts of Ireland. What had happened was the Cromwellian soldiers were the garrison. They fell in love with Gaelic-speaking women, realizing that they were in a very exposed position. They took their wives' names, O'Gara or O'Mara. They began to speak Irish like the rest. And when King Charles's men arrived and said, "Where are the Cromwellians?" Nihigam. Nobody knew anything. And that explained that. Just to tell you a story. Just back one, please, Pauline. And here we have an amazing picture. Go into St. Anne's Cathedral in central Belfast and look up. And in the cobblestones, you will see the heads of eminent bishops of the established church. The Church of Ireland, remember, was the church by law established from Henry VIII's reign right through until 1870, when Mr. Gladstone removed its special status, sparking anger, of course, among the Anglo-Irish gentry, but not among Catholics and Presbyterians and Methodists, who resented the special status of the Church of Ireland. It was just a product of history. But one man who made an impact in Ireland in this period was this man, William Bedell. He was a Cambridge-educated academic who became Provost of Trinity College, which was the Protestant university from 1586. And of course, he was a linguist. And he believed that the only way to convert Irish Catholics to Protestantism was to translate the Bible into Irish. And he became Bishop of Kilmore, modern County Cavan. He hired Irish scribes. He translated the Old Testament. It appeared after his death, actually, printed in 1685 with the New Testament added by the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Tuam. I have a family heirloom. I should really try to show you it before the end of the night, which is the Gaelic Bible, which came down to me on the Presbyterian side of my family, republished in 1830. And you look up at this head in St. Anne's Cathedral in Belfast. This is the Irish language writ large, and you look up and you see Bedell, okay? William Bedell, and then you look at what it says on the book he's holding, Bibla, the Irish word for Bible. Now, the idea was to use this for purposes of proselytization. The Presbyterian Church, of course, which was, in the end, the majority, commanded the allegiance of a majority of the new settlers, from Antrim and down to Tyrone, and certainly to Donegal, but less so in Armagh, Cavan, and perhaps Fermanagh. And what happened there was, of course, the Presbyterians had their own home mission. They brought Gaelic-speaking ministers from the Western Isles of Scotland, like Lewis, sent them into Gaelic Ireland. They had a mission to the west. They had schools on the Glens of Antrim, right down to the late 19th century. But the only Bible, as Gaeilge, as we say, the only Bible in Irish until 1970 was the Church of Ireland version. And it's all down to this man when he died as a captive of the O'Reillys in 1642 during the Great Rebellion. When he died of fever, they gave him really a state funeral. He's buried at Kilmore outside Cavan Town because he had embraced their language. Bishop William Bedell. The next slide, please. I think we'll have to go 2 slides up because the next slide. And of course, I don't have to introduce this man of happy, pious, and immortal memory. Yes, it's King Billy himself, who actually caused a row about what telling stories. I was in Stormont the other day, giving them some advice on an exhibition that they're hoping to put on, reflecting the history of that place. And one of the big icons there is a painting. In fact, I'll show you it. Hang on. This is a picture of it. A painting is called King William's Entry into Ireland, 1690. And look at it. There's a king, some soldiers, and so on. This was bought in 1933 at the instance of Sir James Craig, then Lord Craigavon, the first Prime Minister, to adorn Stormont. But after honourable members looked at it for a while, they were a bit worried. First of all, there's a papal figure in the clouds above, bestowing a kind of, can I find him? Kind of a benediction on King Billy, you know? In fact, it's the Pope himself. There he is there, you can see him. And secondly, there was a friar with rosary beads leading King William's horse. Some thought this wasn't the King Billy they knew and loved, and an attack was made in the picture. King Billy, the Pope was stabbed, and blood seemed to flow down the canvas, but it was red paint that one of the Scottish protesters had thrown. It was May 1933, and I was there. I'm only joking. But the painting is still there, savaged by that vicious blade. But this is the real King Billy. He probably didn't ride a white horse. It wouldn't have been wise. But of course, his arrival in Ireland, of course, was a turning point in Irish history. He defeated the Catholic King James, who had been kicked out of England because of his absolute ideas of absolute power, his attempts to replace generals and parliamentarians and the Irish chief deputy by Roman Catholics to turn back the clock on a reformation that was too long established to disturb, really. King Billy comes in. He was a very liberal man himself. He wanted, when he defeated the Irish at the Boyne, and particularly at Aughrim, the following year, General Ginkle was involved, he wanted to sign off peace on very fair terms, allowing the Irish to return to their lands or join the continental armies that they wanted, and not be subjected to any penal disabilities. But that was overturned by the Protestant Parliament, which had been established, overthrowing the Catholic Parliament of King James. These are, times of great change. The next slide, please. And that brings us into the Old Irish Parliament, which first met in 1691, composed of the landed gentry of the country, the O'Neills of Shane's Castle, the Abercorns of Baronscourt, the Brookes of Colebrook, the Archdales of Castle Archdale, and the rest. And of course, it's a very undemocratic parliament, obviously. You have a House of Commons, a House of Lords. It meets from 1729 in Parliament House, opposite Trinity there in the centre of Dublin. And it eventually becomes known as Grattan's Parliament. But it's remembered for the notorious penal laws. Let's just have a look at this. We can see that in, turning over the next slide, please. This is just a flavour of the penal laws passed by the Irish Parliament in the century after the Boyne. Because remember, the Irish Catholics, a majority, 80% of the population, had taken up arms against the Protestant throng. So they were to be deprived of civil rights, the ownership of land, education, the right to bear arms. And these laws were passed. They excluded friars and regular orders who were thought to be the Pope's brigade from Ireland. Bishops were banished from the country on pain of death. Ordinary priests had to register in their county towns. We have a list of them. And the idea is that by preventing the ordination of Catholic clergy, the Catholic religion would really die out for want of clergy and for want of people who could obviously bestow the sacraments of baptism and the rest at that time. The language is quite blunt. They were papists, it was popery, and these were acts to prevent the growth of popery. There were similar laws in England, but these were passed by the Irish Parliament in Dublin. Were they enforced rigorously in that century after 1691? When there was a threat to the British Crown, during the Jacobite risings, when, Bonnie Prince Charlie arrived in Scotland and so on, there would be a vicious kind of imposition of the laws. Priests would be executed, thrown into prison. For long periods, of course, they were more severe in the spirit than in practice, you might say. But this leads to, it has an amazing effect on Irish Catholicism, and to some extent, they also affect Presbyterians. Catholics were excluded from civil rights, from power, from education. The only thing they could do was open up public houses and hotels. Many of them get involved in the wine trade, like the Hennessy's. That was a loophole. They become more prosperous than many of the landlords. In fact, they're lending money to the gentry by the end of the century. Daniel O'Connell is the first Catholic barrister, qualifying in 1798 as the penal laws come to an effective end. The next slide, please. And of course, King William was the hero of the Irish Parliament. You can see his horse blown up in 1929, the front legs blown off it. It stood on a plinth outside Trinity College until 1929. The next slide, please. And if you go into the Old Irish Parliament, the House of Lords preserved, you can see one of the earliest tapestries of William crossing the Boyne. I brought a loyalist group from East Belfast there. I often bring loyalists to Dublin. And one wee girl said to the Bank of Ireland porter who takes you in real dub, she said to him, "We've got that in our wall," he said. "You may have a copy, madam. We have the original." There it is. The next slide, please. But of course, this is a period for Catholics of mass rock Catholicism. Mass is said in the hills and glens of Gorchin and Carrickmore and Ahiyarn and, Derry Lynn during that whole period. These are furtive gatherings. There's a lookout watching for the hated redcoats, the much feared redcoats. Many Protestant landowners are sympathetic to the Catholics. The Earl Bishop of Derry, for example, Frederick Harvey, who's a very liberal man in the late 1700s, he allows the Catholics to attend Mass in the Mussenden Temple overlooking the Atlantic on the north coast. And there are other examples of that. But the pressure of the penal laws forces the remaining, few score Catholic gentry, like the Earls of Antrim, to convert to Protestantism. The Earls of Antrim become Protestant in 1730. I'm just reading the papers last month. The Earl of Antrim died at the age of 86 last month, and he had a Catholic funeral because, 90 years ago, 100 years ago, the Church of Ireland Earl of Antrim married the Marchioness of Bute, who was a Scottish Catholic noblewoman, and the sons were brought up in the Catholic faith. And so the present Earl of Antrim is a nominal Catholic at least. So it's very interesting. But there it is. Presbyterians, how did the laws affect them? Well, they were very, very hurt because they had supported the ascendancy at the Battle of the Boyne and all of that, had taken up arms to defend the Protestant position in Ireland. And they were the dissenters. Distrusted, they had a very democratic church, they were open to democratic and radical ideas. Two things that irked them. First of all, their marriages weren't recognized by the state, and they couldn't become civil servants, even postmen, for long periods of the 19th century. And that bar on Presbyterians having full status wasn't removed until 1844, on the eve of the Great Famine. The next slide, please. And of course, this is a typical landlord house. This is Beaver Park outside Belfast on the Lagan. These are the people who controlled Ireland, down to the Act of Union of 1801, but of course, effectively down to the First World War. The next slide, please. And of course, it's at the end of the 18th century that Ireland is rocked by two revolutions. You have the American War of Independence. So many Presbyterians from Ulster had migrated to the colonies, the 13 colonies under the Union Jack in North America. And of course, they objected to taxation without representation. They joined Washington's army and they fought for the great American Republic. And they sent word home, no man is our master, to their relatives in Ardstraw or Collibaki, encouraging them to follow suit. And here we have the Irish Parliament and State, but here we have a movement that emerges from that period. A reform movement gets underway called the Irish Volunteers. It's captained by the gentry. It's open to Presbyterians and to Protestants and Presbyterians. Towns like Belfast, Newry, Omagh, Enniskillen, you have Presbyterian, throughout Ireland really. You soon have 40,000 armed men who call themselves the Volunteers. And they become the cutting edge of reform. They want a more democratic parliament. They get free trade for Ireland in 1779. They get the Constitution of 1782, which declares Ireland an independent kingdom, the Kingdom of Ireland, as against the Kingdom of England. And just as some of their number want more radical reforms, to widen the vote, to include the middle classes, the Volunteers are sort of closed down by their leaders. The next slide, please. But the Volunteers have an impact. They're a liberal movement in the north of Ireland. In places like Castlederg, for example, Castlefin on the Tyrone-Donegal border, they begin to enroll Catholics, which is totally illegal under the penal laws, in their number. And in Belfast, the Presbyterians built the first Catholic chapel in 1784. And the Volunteers, led by their Captain Waddell Cunningham, the richest businessman in Belfast, leads them to the first mass. The parish priest, who was of old Gaelic stock, Father Hugh O'Donnell, greets them from the pulpit on that May day in 1784. And he said, he says that theirs, he said, is a friendship which shall never be surpassed, which shall never be forgotten. Belfast's golden age, small Catholic minority, maybe 10%, cross-community harmony, and radical ideas are coming in. And they're soon transformed by the French Revolution. The next slide, please. The French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, brings a group of middle-class Presbyterian businessmen and lawyers in Belfast together with Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tone is a product of the Church of Ireland and Trinity College. He's the son of a coach builder. He's of English planter stock in County Kildare. He has got himself, he's a barrister, but he's got himself a job as a pamphleteer for the very moderate Catholic Association that's protesting that Catholics should be given full civil rights. He's just written a pamphlet And notice what he calls it. This is the actual title. An argument on behalf of the Catholics of Ireland. What he's really arguing is something he believes in his heart. This young, restless lawyer, who's very funny, you read his diaries, has a great love affair with his wife. He says that Ireland will never be an independent nation until the Protestants, the Catholics, and the Presbyterians form an alliance. And after his visit on the 14th of October 1791 to a tavern in Belfast Crown Entry, where with people like Samuel Neilson and Henry John McCracken, they formed the Society of United Irishmen. It's a moderate civil rights movement, but it's eventually driven underground. It's strong in Belfast, Dublin, Cork. It's strong in Eastern Ulster, where Catholics are not a major threat. It's less strong as you go into Armagh, Monaghan, and Tyrone, where the old bitterness of 1641 is remembered on both sides. But by 1795, the leaders, Tone, McCracken, or Neilson, mainly Northern Presbyterians, a sprinkling of middle-class Catholics from the south, they are seeking French military help because the French Revolution has brought down the king and the aristocracy there. And they want liberty and equality in Ireland. The next slide, please. And this leads inexorably, of course, to the United Irishmen. There's their leaders. And I mean, they're all Protestants. I can't see a Catholic in sight. There's Samuel Neilson, the son of a Presbyterian minister in County Down, one of Belfast's wealthiest woolen draper, Wolftone, you always know the sharp nose, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, the son of the biggest landowner in Ireland, the Duke of Leinster, Thomas Russell, former British officer from County Cork, Dr. William Drennan, a Presbyterian professional from the north. And of course, they want an Irish Republic by military force. They try to evangelize, they hit the Irish language barrier. They find that over much of Ireland you have the Catholic Defenders as a sectarian movement which sees Irish independence in terms of Catholic power. They also find the emerging Orange Order in places like Mid-Ulster, which sees the future as controlled by a Protestant monopoly of power. The sectarian violence in Mid-Ulster in places like Mahary, Cookstown, Rathfryland, on they go. The next slide, please. And of course, in this period, the Protestants of Belfast, who are mainly Presbyterian, they call the Harp Festival, invite harpists from all over Ireland, and Edward Bunting, a musical collector and church organist from Armagh, who lived with the very, very cultured McCracken family in the town, the Scottish family. He records the Earls, Shivé, Shimor, and the Coolan. And we have harp music today, the harp music of ancient Ireland, thanks to the Belfast Presbyterian, who captured that in Ireland's golden age. And of course, there's great interest in the Irish language from the Presbyterians. The Presbyterian Academy in Belfast, which is now called INST, had its first professor of Irish, a man called Patrick Lynch from Southdown. The next slide, please. But of course, the Battle of the Diamond is changing things. Next slide, please. The Orange Order emerges. Jemmy Hope, the Presbyterian weaver from Mollusk, his short autobiography, published before his death in 1846, is the best testimony I've ever read against sectarian hatred on this island. The next slide, please. And there, the Battle of Ballynahinch ending, the 1798 rising in Ulster. The rising is crushed, 30,000 die. You have a reaction. The next slide, please. The Act of Union is passed. Henry John McCracken, the son of a Belfast Presbyterian business family, is executed in the High Street. His sister, going on to have a long life at the age of 96, wept by her brother's scaffold. The next slide, please. And here we have Daniel O'Connell emerging, a man who opposed the violence in 98. Who said that Irish independence wasn't worth a drop of blood. And as a rising barrister who couldn't take silk because he was a Catholic. Remember, the penal laws are not removed to 1829. It was his achievement. But he did it with a lot of Protestant support from people like, the Archdale family of County Fermanagh, who favoured Catholic emancipation, big house families. But of course, he did it on the masses of Irish Catholics. The Catholic Association was formed to collect the penny rent. The British government under the Duke of Wellington feared revolution if they didn't grant Catholics full rights, and that comes in 1829 for Irish and indeed British Catholics. That means that you have the rise of a Catholic middle class. Colleges can be opened, schools, they can go to university, and they're trying to play catch up because everybody else had schools, but the Catholics didn't. They had head schools, and the sons of the wealthy were sent to the continent for education in the Irish colleges. Next slide, please. Henry Cook, and of course he is the nemesis of Daniel O'Connell. Henry Cook came from a different background to the United Irishmen in Belfast. He was from Mahara in South Londonderry, South Derry. His people were yeomen, Orange men, who opposed the rising. And he's brought up in that. Well, he went to a Catholic head school. Education highly valued by the Presbyterians and the Catholics, the strong farmers' children. He's considering medicine as a career, but he eventually becomes a Presbyterian minister. He's given a great church in Belfast, May Street Church. And of course, Cook warns he's opposed to 98, he's opposed to the liberalism of the United Irishmen. He drives the liberal Presbyterians, led by Henry Montgomery, out of the church by 1830. And he becomes a shaping influence on Irish Protestantism, not just Presbyterianism. He addresses a great Protestant meeting at Hillsborough, chaired by the Marquis of Downshire. Notice this alliance between the upper-class Anglican Marquis and the jumped-up Presbyterian minister. And he tells the Protestants of Ulster that they must join together, regardless of their denomination, against the unholy trinity, popery, liberalism, and nationalism. And that he's a proto-unionist in a way. And the message of Cook will be hearkened to slowly by many Presbyterians, but as Ulster industrializes, becomes prosperous, becomes more integrated to the empire, shipbuilding and linen as the century goes on, Cook lives to see the emergence of a kind of a pan-Protestantism, whereas Catholicism has become a monolithic movement as well with the 1860s under Cardinal Cullen, the first Catholic cardinal, who brings Irish Catholicism into line with Rome. And so you have this widening gulf, turning its back on the liberalism of Belfast when they built St. Mary's Chapel. The next slide. The Great Famine on Baltimore, a million died, a million emigrated. Irish begins to decline. Many of those who died were native Irish speakers, spoken by 2/3 of the population in 1845, when the population was 8.5 million. That will fall back to 4.5 million, and only 10% of the people could speak Irish by 1900, mainly in the West. The next slide, please. Next slide. And of course, Belfast, growing rapidly, drawing people from the 9 counties, of course, becomes a battlefield as people move from the countryside, bringing their secret societies, orange and green, and their weapons with them. This is the Battle of the Chapel Fields. August, long hot summers, worked about the weather here until fairly recently. This is the Battle of the Chapel Fields outside the new St. Malachy's Church in Alfred Street in 1864. About 50 people die, and these riots are repeated right down to the Black Days of 1922. The next slide, please. But of course, by 1870, politics are beginning to emerge, more democratic politics. In Britain, it's the Liberals versus the Tories. It's building up the British Empire, the secret of England's greatness. And then, of course, you have here a Home Rule movement is formed by an Ulster Protestant barrister called Isaac Butt. Butt was the son of the rectory in County Donegal. His father was a Church of Ireland rector. He was a former Orange man, professor in Trinity, able barrister. He defends Fenian prisoners who had taken up arms in 1867 for a republic. He found most of them decent men, well-cultivated men, educated men, and he felt Ireland has to get some form of self-government within the empire to prevent recurring insurrections. He wasn't a nationalist. He was a liberal reformer. He formed the Home Rule Party, but it wasn't until Charles Stuart Parnell became head, an Anglo-Irish Protestant landlord, in 1879 that the Home Rule Party became the first modern political party in Britain. About sort of a tenth of its MPs were Protestants. One of its key members was Jeremiah Jordan, a Methodist lay preacher and extensive shopkeeper in Enniskillen, who sat for South Fermanagh until 1911. I've been to his grave at Ahave, a great tribute to an Ahave, and he left the money that kept the Nationalist Fighting Fund going for elections right down to 1970 in Fermanagh. It seems unusual. A Methodist had left this fund. But the Home Rule Party wins 85 seats, a more democratic. Orangism becomes the underpinning of the new unionism. By 1886, Ulster has divided. It's a marginal province had been slight majority of Catholics to 1851. Now it's tilting the other way with industrialisation. But Parnell, who brought Ireland to the brink of Home Rule, is destroyed by his love affair with Catherine O'Shea, an Englishwoman who never visited Ireland. The next slide, please. Gladstone, of course, believes that justice for Ireland. My mission is to pacify Ireland. He not only brings in Home Rule, he attempts to reform the land question to give the farmers rights. The 1882 Land Acts brings in fair rents and freedom of sale. He also, of course, is responsible for the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland and the first and second Home Rule bills, which are eventually blocked by the House of Lords. The next slide, please. And then, of course, there are Protestant Home Rulers, even nationalists. Here's the Reverend J.B. Armour of Ballymoney, Presbyterian minister, brilliant orator, who until his death in 1928 was a supporter of Home Rule for Ireland, but not independent Home Rule. The next slide, please. Colonel Saunderson, a landlord from County Cavan, a former Liberal MP, becomes an Orangeman and a Unionist MP, and he's the founder of the modern Ulster Unionist Party in the 1880s. He's buried 16 yards on the wrong side of the border in his estate in Castle Saunderson. His gates are in Fermanagh, his grave is in Cavan, as is his big house. The next slide, please. Another nationalist, Richard Magee, a major figure in the British trade union movement, a Protestant, we don't know what his denomination was, from Lurgan, who was a co-founder of the Dockers Union in Britain, comes back to Ireland, opens up a factory in Lurgan, employing 200 people, becomes a Home Rule MP for Mid-Tyrone in 1918. There were a few Catholic Unionists like Sir Dennis Henry, who became the first Lord Chief Justice, but considerably more Protestant Home Rulers, who included Lord Perry, the Managing Director of Harland and Wolff. The next slide. These men usher in a new revolution. 1893, Conor McGill is formed, the Gaelic League, by Dr. Douglas Hyde, the son of a Church of Ireland rector of big house background, Owen MacNeill from Glenarm, a product of St. Maricus College. They want to restore Irish as a spoken language. If they had emerged maybe 25 years before, they could have done for Irish what has been done in Wales for Welsh. They were just a generation too late, but Irish, a cultural revolution gets underway, especially after the fall of Parnell, when there's a civil war breaking out among the nationalists, pro and anti-Parnell. And that civil war, of course, allows a cultural revolution. Irish language classes. In Belfast, the first chairman of the Gaelic League is Dr. Sinclair Boyd, a Protestant surgeon. The next slide, please. The Home Rule Party, of course, is reunited after 1900 under John Redmond, a moderate Irishman, an imperialist, and his northern deputy, Joe Devlin, who had been consolidating the Catholic vote and had founded or refounded the Hibernian Order, the ancient order of Hibernians, which becomes, if you like, the equivalent to Orangism in the Catholic community. 100,000 strong to match the Orange Order before the First World War. The next slide, please. The struggle for Home Rule captures Edward Carson as the voice of Ulster Unionism, a man who wanted to save the whole of Ireland but failed, gets the best deal for his clients, signing the quasi-religious covenant in 1912, signed by, if you include women, almost over 400,000 Ulster Protestants. The next slide, please. The covenant itself not only states the case against Home Rule, but reserves the right to use force. The next slide, please. Guns imported from Germany in 1914, an Irish volunteer movement formed in opposition to the UVF. The next slide, please. The Easter Rising, of course. The executions create a slide of support for the Home Rule Party and a new support for Sinn Féin, the Republican Party. And the next slide, please. By 1920, Lloyd George is heading a Tory-dominated government supported by the Ulster Unionists. The Tories had always supported their friends in the north of Ireland. They saw Home Rule as a threat to the empire. This time, it's agreed to give the south of Ireland Home Rule, but Ulster, or some definition of it, will be excluded. 9 counties were proposed. James Craig, the leading unionist, rejected that. He wants a 6-county entity with his own police force, the UVF, transformed into the, let's be honest, sectarian Ulster Special Constabulary, elections and a new government. All of this happens by June 1921, 100 years ago. The next slide, please. The War of Independence, of course, gets underway. The Dáil is formed in Dublin. It redeclares the Republic. The IRA wage a war north and south against British forces. The British send in the Black and Tanned. You have reprisals, often against innocent people, outraging liberal opinion in Britain, even the king, who wants a truce. The next slide, please. Partition occurs, the Irish Free State is born. But in the north, if we think about it, the early 20s see the laying down of the framework of the state, the abolition of PR, which was seen as a minority safeguard. For local elections, you have gerrymandering. The Catholic community become a state within a state. They don't see themselves as part of the state at all. They look to Dublin, which fails them abominably in the 20s and 30s. Even worse, the British government turned its back on John Bull's backyard. If you like, forswearing their responsibility to both communities in Northern Ireland. But of course, in 1947, after the war, in which the South was neutral, the 1947 Education Act models the Butler Act in Britain, and it leads, of course, to the rise of the John Hume generation, the Bernadette Devlins, a Catholic middle class by the 1960s. Now remember, the Catholics had a very small middle class, based on the pubs, going back to the Penal Laws. The only people who could get a prosperous occupation were the publicans. Their sons become the doctors, but by 1947, it's the working class boys and girls from Bernadette Devlin's estate in Cooktown, from West Belfast, from the Bogside, like John Hume, who are emerging. They are not prepared to accept the second-class citizenship which their forefathers accepted. The world is changing. The Black Civil Rights Movement, television, a Labour government in Britain. Let's see the next slide, please. And here we have, of course, what happens in the South. A Catholic state emerges. In the 20s, there were safeguards for the Protestant minority of 10%. They had 50% of the seats in the Senate. But of course, the Catholic Church had extensive power. And that power would be used again and again, but particularly in 1951, when Dr. Noel Brown's radical scheme to provide medical assistance for mothers and babies was blocked by the Catholic Church, bringing down the government. And of course, convincing Northern Protestants that home rule or independence was indeed Rome rule. The next slide, please. But of course, despite the Cold War between North and South, which continues, we have the O'Neill-Lemass meeting of 1965.
Working on the main television.
No.
We would need, I think, to mute there. Someone
This thing's fucking useless.
with me. I would need to mute.
Well,
Sorry.
I don't know. It took it. What time is it now? It took me half an hour for it to go through all this.
Sorry, can you just boot yourself there, please?
Turn it on, and I still can't get any sound on it.
Anyway, the key thing is, in the background, you have some of the old war horses. There's Frank Aiken, who waged a war, and then very often a sectarian war in South Armagh, Minister of Foreign Affairs. There's Sean Lemass, who fought in the Rising. There's Terence O'Neill, whose father was the first MP killed in the First World War. And they discuss matters of mutual interest. But O'Neill, of course, is being attacked by his right wing, led by Brian Faulkner, for this meeting. His position will become even weaker in 2 or 3 years' time. And of course, Ian Paisley is emerging in the background, a minor critic in the 50s. He becomes a more major force, a gadfly perhaps, but a more destructive critic by the mid-1960s. The next slide, please. The IRA campaign, of course, reflected itself through the history of the state, particularly the border campaign, but it was a total failure. And the IRA, when they dumped arms, said the Northern Catholics hadn't supported them. Liberal Unionists said this was a chance for Brookborough, before he left in '63, or O'Neill, to attract Catholics into the Unionist Party. Nothing was done. John Hume, of course, qualifying as a teacher after training briefly to be a priest, returning to teach in Strabane and then Derry, making films, even getting Brian Faulkner in one of them, how to make Derry an entrepot for Northwest Ireland. His films, and nobody knows these, but they're amazing films. You'll get them in Northern Ireland screen. He worked with Geoffrey Agate, later murdered by the IRA. He's trying to get business there. Agate headed up, of course, DuPont in Derry, and he's talking about his experience in Derry at that period. And of course, he becomes one of the movers in this new civil rights movement emerging in 1967. The next slide, please. Of course, unionism sees the civil rights movement as an IRA front. It reminds me very much, O'Neill had promised reform, but he hadn't delivered. The real dividing line west of the Bann was the failure to bring a university to Derry Londonderry in 1965. Despite the support right across the board, people like the Liberal Protestant solicitor Claude Wilton, John Hume, even Commander Albert Anderson, a strong unionist who was mayor, they went to Stormont in their cavalcade, but the government had made up its decision. The university was going to Coleraine. Even McGee, which was a Protestant third-level institution linked to Trinity, would be denied a university. That was seen as the end of the road, that and the severing of the rail link from Belfast and Portadown and Dublin to Omagh and Derry. And of course, the dragon's teeth were sown for the civil rights movement, the 5th of October, and all of that. And of course, we're in, next slide, please, we're in very quickly to the Troubles. Paisley's becoming, of course, he's got rid of a captain by 69. He now wants rid of a major. He's attacking a populist program, evangelical Protestantism plus populism. He attacks the dry closets in the Bandside. He will be a Westminster and a Stormont MP by 1970. He's no longer a man to be laughed at. The next slide, please. And British troops arrive, of course, in a near civil war in Belfast and Derry in 1969. And the rest, I think, is history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eamon. That was a whistle